When trying to get a sense of how rich a country is, the most common term you'll hear is
GDP.
Or GDP.
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 It's GDP.
GDP, or gross domestic product. While many internationally consider Australia's main gross domestic product to be Vegemite, the GDP is actually the market value of all finished goods and services produced in a country in a year. Obviously, that is total gibberish, but here's what it means. Let's take Australia. Our GDP is the number we get when we add up the price of every single product or service produced in our country when it reaches the point where it's sold for the last time in Australia. For example, let's say your job is to make sugar, and a third of the sugar you make you take to the local market, and you sell it in little bags for people to use in their household cooking. The sale of that sugar would count towards Australia's GDP. But another third of the sugar you make, you actually sell to a local sweets company that uses it to make lollipops that they will eventually go on to sell. The sale of that sugar would not add to the GDP because it's not a finished good. But eventually the sale of the lollipops would. You see, in this way we don't end up with a bunch of double-ups. The only time the sale of unfinished goods or intermediate goods count towards the GDP is when they're being exported, which is what you do with that last third of sugar. You sell it to a company in Japan, and it doesn't really matter what that Japanese company does with it because that's the last time that sugar will be sold in Australia. Oh, and it's not just the sale of physical objects, by the way, like the money that doctors make or dog walkers make or teachers or babysitters, all of that counts towards the GDP too because they're selling a service. To put it simply, GDP gives you a sense of how big a country's economy is. It's not perfect though, because there are heaps of things that can't be measured that still affect the wealth of a country, like having non-polluted air or clean drinking water or a bunch of tourist attractions or even just the happiness of the citizens. All these things are super valuable, but hard to put a dollar value on. Economics? Bad at measuring things other than money? Shocking. Where GDP does come in handy though is comparing countries, and it's a pretty decent way of seeing who the most powerful players are in the global arena. For example, as of 2022, the US's GDP is 20.94 trillion US dollars compared to Australia's 1.33 trillion. Give or take, as the exchange rate changes with every second, but clearly they dwarf us. What if you wanted to compare how well off each of our citizens are? Well, then you would need to divide the GDP by the population, giving you the GDP per capita. In the US, the GDP per capita is about 63.5 thousand US dollars, while in Australia it's about 51.8 thousand. So as you can see, much, much closer. Oh, while I have you here, the growth rate of a country's GDP is another big thing that people talk about because it's a common way of determining the relative health of a country's economy, particularly when that growth is actually negative. Anyway, that's gross domestic product. Gross.